The wind that morning carried more than dust. It pulled at a loose canvas nailed across a rusted window in Barrack 12 of Camp Hearn, Texas, revealing a faint phrase painted in German. Licht bitte. Light, please. The guard who noticed it, Private John Mendez, almost tore it down before hesitating. He looked closer and saw that the cloth was not a curtain at all. It was a painting, a trembling depiction of sunrise, brushstrokes made from crushed brick and instant coffee, spreading warmth over a cold concrete wall. Instead of removing it, Mendez pinned the canvas back carefully, straightening its edges, as if restoring a window to the outside world. That single act, simple and wordless, became legend within the camp. A note in the Camp Hearn Journal, 1945, recorded it plainly. Prisoners painted sunlight on canvas to brighten their barracks. For the men behind those fences, captured soldiers of the Wehrmacht, Afrika Korps, and Luftwaffe, the days blurred into the same gray routine. Roll call, rations, silence. Yet art found a way through the monotony. When one of the older prisoners, Kurt Voss, a landscape painter from Dresden, asked for chalk, he was given leftover carpenter's dye instead. Within days, the walls bloomed with color, rivers, meadows, even the illusion of open sky above bunks that smelled of pine soap and sweat. To the guards, it seemed harmless. To the prisoners, it was oxygen. Men who once painted military emblems now painted shadows of clouds. A captured corporal told a Red Cross officer, "When you paint the sun, for a moment, you forget which side of the fence you're on." Each brushstroke became defiance, not of the guards, but of despair. The act of painting itself whispered rebellion against darkness. Licht bitte was more than a plea for sunlight. It was a demand to be human again. Soon, that canvas-covered window turned into a gathering point. Prisoners stood around it after mealtime, talking softly about the Alps, about wives and sisters, about color palettes and stolen childhoods. One evening, a sergeant carved a small wooden sign below the painting that read simply, Gallery 1. Gallery 1. The guards didn't remove it. By the time spring arrived, Camp Hearn had 6 galleries, each marked by art that transformed captivity into creation. Some works were biblical, others pastoral, some hauntingly abstract, but all were fragments of light trapped behind wire. And so, the story of the POW art exhibitions began, not with permission, not with order, but with a gust of wind revealing a message, light, please. The camp orchestra had no violins, no trumpets, no drums, only walls. Yet every Sunday evening, from Barrack 9 of Camp Hearn, faint rhythms drifted out, carried by the tapping of spoons and the hum of painted instruments. It began when Joseph Sepp Weigand, a former art student from Munich and a member of the Afrika Korps, took charcoal from burned wood and began sketching outlines of a grand orchestra across the wall. A cello here, a clarinet there, and a conductor in mid-motion. The prisoners called it Das unsichtbare Konzert, the invisible concert. When boredom gnawed at them, Weigand stood before the mural and began to move his hands like a maestro, pretending to cue the imaginary players. Around him, men hummed along, each taking an instrument from the wall with their eyes. Laughter echoed. A few guards stopped outside, bewildered by the sight of 100 men performing with nothing but air and imagination. The idea spread. Artists painted trumpets, violas, and pianos directly onto plywood scraps. The Red Cross report of 1945 noted the phenomenon with clinical brevity, visual music therapy sessions organized by artist prisoners. But those few words couldn't capture what it truly was, a resurrection of sound from silence. A diary entry found decades later from Private Heinrich Balser, one of the participants, read, "We painted the music we could no longer play. Some of us had lost fingers to frostbite, others courage, but in that room, our souls remembered rhythm. The American guards, initially suspicious, began to attend quietly at the door. One night, the camp chaplain, Captain Robert Lewis, brought a harmonica. He joined the concert, playing softly while the prisoners pretended to accompany him with their painted instruments. When he finished, no one clapped. They simply stood, motionless, before the mural. Then someone whispered, "Wieder bitte." Again, please. It was a paradox that only captivity could produce. An orchestra with no instruments, a conductor with no baton, and yet, for a few minutes, a real harmony between enemies. Weeks later, Weygand added one final touch. He painted a broken violin resting on the ground, its strings replaced by a white dove. Beneath it, he wrote in careful script, "Silence is also a song." That painting would later appear in the Trinidad POW art exhibition of 1945, catalogued as Piece Number 17. The visitors didn't know it had once been part of a concert conducted entirely by memory. In a place built for control, art created chaos of the most beautiful kind, where prisoners conducted symphonies from shadows, and a painted orchestra played louder than any gunfire they'd ever known. At Camp Fort Devens, Massachusetts, 1945, one of the captured Luftwaffe airmen, Lieutenant Otto Reisner, aged 28, sat alone in the recreation hut with a mirror cracked down the middle. His right eye was gone, destroyed by shrapnel near Falaise. Yet every afternoon, he returned to that mirror, sketching the contours of his face over and over. What emerged after weeks was something no one expected, a self-portrait of a man without eyes. When the American art instructor Helen Stratton, who volunteered for the Red Cross, came to inspect the work, she asked quietly, "Why no eyes?" Reisner answered without turning, "Because I want to see again." That sentence traveled through the camp like wildfire. It was copied into the Fort Devens Cultural Activity Report 1945, and eventually into Smithsonian archives under the section Art of Captivity. The portrait itself was haunting. Heavy oil strokes of gray and brown, cheekbones sharp as blades, the sockets left blank and pale. Around the head swirled colors of burnt orange, fading to black at the edges. Some prisoners whispered that Reisner had painted not himself, but the blindness of an entire generation. He had once been a painter of aircraft nose art for the Luftwaffe, decorating Messerschmitt fuselages with fierce birds and lightning bolts. Those images were meant to frighten. This one was meant to confess. The transformation was staggering. In his small notebook, found years later in Munich, Reisner wrote, "I thought I lost an eye in France. I learned here that I had lost sight long before. Sight of people, sight of mercy." Visitors at the 1945 exhibition stood silent before his canvas. A U.S. sergeant reportedly murmured, "That's not a prisoner's painting, that's humanity staring back." Art critics later described the piece as an early symbol of moral rehabilitation, the moment when the hand that once drew emblems of war dared to paint guilt itself. One of his fellow POWs, sculptor Hans Kruger, later sculpted a companion piece from clay, a head emerging from a wall, its eyes uncarved. He said it was to remind everyone that seeing is not with the eyes, but with what's left of the soul. Together, their works became the emotional center of the Fort Devens Art Show, attracting hundreds of visitors from Boston and Worcester. The local newspaper headline read, "Enemy artists see what we forgot." Years later, when Reisner was repatriated, he carried only one item with him, a photograph of his eyeless portrait. He wrote to Stratton once more, "Tell them I'm painting again, this time landscapes." It was not a painting of defeat, but of awakening. A moment when blindness revealed vision, and art became the only way to see again. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, April 1945, tensions inside the German compound had reached breaking point. Two factions, the hardliners who still clung to the Reich and the moderates who only wanted to go home, had turned the mess hall into a battlefield of words. Threats, fists, and chairs had already flown. The guards stood ready, rifles half raised, fearing the chaos would explode. Then Captain William Reese, the camp's morale officer, made an unorthodox move. He ordered the guards to bring in a painting. It was a quiet landscape titled Peace Farm, painted by POW Ernst Bach, once a rural schoolteacher from Schleswig. The canvas depicted a small farmhouse beside a pond, a horse grazing beneath a chestnut tree, and in the far corner, two children chasing geese into the light. Reese carried it into the dining hall himself. The prisoners froze as he propped the frame against the wall between two broken tables. Nobody spoke. One man muttered, "That's my home," and sat down. Another whispered, "He painted silence." Minutes passed. The room emptied of noise as if the painting had absorbed it all. The confrontation dissolved not because anyone won, but because everyone remembered what losing looked like. Later that evening, Reese filed an incident report noting the outcome with military brevity. Conflict diffused, cause uncertain, emotional response to artwork observed. But the event gained mythical status among both prisoners and guards. The U.S. Army Morale Report number 222, 1945, added an annotation: art utilized as pacification medium, results unexpectedly positive. For Bach, the painter, the moment was deeply personal. His diary, now kept at the Bundesarchiv Koblenz, contains a single line written the next day: "A painting ended what discipline could not." The symbolism was inescapable. A man once ordered to destroy bridges had painted one instead. In the weeks that followed, Peace Farm was moved to the camp library, where guards and prisoners alike passed it daily. Some would stop, even for seconds, to breathe. The Red Cross later photographed it for their wartime arts report. The only image in the file marked "moral transformation in progress." A rumor spread that one of the camp's American cooks asked for a copy of the painting after the war, saying he wanted to hang it in his diner back in Indiana. No one knows if Bach ever learned that his quiet pond and chestnut tree hung in a place that smelled of coffee and pancakes. But perhaps that is how peace begins. Not with treaties or signatures, but with a brushstroke in a mess hall full of men who had forgotten how to listen. Her face appeared first in 1945 at Camp Trinidad, Colorado, painted on a scrap of bedsheet stretched over a wooden crate. Blonde hair, pale blue eyes, a faint smile turned slightly downward. She could have been anyone. Beneath the image, a prisoner had written only one word: Sehnsucht. Longing. The painter, Corporal Lucas Mahler, once sketched fashion posters in Munich before the draft took him to North Africa. He had never drawn a woman during captivity, until that winter, when snow sealed the camp in silence and the men began to dream aloud of warmth, of faces, of touch. In his diary, later found by the Red Cross, Mahler wrote, "I do not remember her name. Perhaps she was never real, but every man here paints her." He was right. Across Camp Trinidad, dozens of similar portraits appeared, women of smoke and memory. Some smiled, some prayed, others looked away. None were based on real photographs. They were fragments of tenderness, imagined by men who had not seen a woman for years. The Red Cross. Psychological Summary of 1945 observed cautiously, subjects depict female forms not as erotic projection, but as restoration of emotional identity. Memory therapy via symbolic femininity. One afternoon, an American nurse named Eleanor Price, stationed nearby, visited the art hall and froze before Mahler's canvas. She whispered, "She looks kind." Mahler replied, Kindness is the only part I still remember. It was not lust they painted. It was mercy. The mercy of being remembered as sons, not soldiers. In another barrack, an older prisoner, Carl Zimmer, drew his wife purely from memory, line by line, as if rebuilding her from ash. When finished, he said to the younger men, "This is my forgiveness for surviving." That drawing now rests in the German Historical Museum under the title Frau im Nebel, Woman in the Fog. Among these imagined faces, something subtle happened. The camp softened. Men who once spoke only of escape began to share stories of home, laughter, meals, lullabies. The barracks, once filled with commands, now echoed with whispered names of wives and fiancées. A U.S. guard recalled in an interview years later, "Those paintings changed the air. You could feel it, like someone had opened a window." Even after the exhibition ended, the portraits remained pinned to the walls, yellowing with time, guarded like relics. One POW was overheard telling another, "If I die here, tell her she was real to me." Viewers today might see only faded paint and canvas, but within those fragile faces lived the most human rebellion imaginable. The refusal to forget tenderness in a place built for obedience. And to you watching now, if you were in their place, far from home, would you have painted the same face, or would you have forgotten how love once looked? By spring 1946, the art exhibition at Camp Trinidad had officially ended. The war was over. The barbed wire still stood, but the tension had dissolved into a quiet waiting. For ships, for letters, for news from the rubble of Europe. The prisoners were told to take down their paintings, but when the American guards began removing them from the wooden walls, something unexpected happened. They didn't destroy them, they framed them. The men from the maintenance unit, carpenters, mechanics, even a former artillery sergeant, began dismantling leftover ammunition crates, cutting the boards into clean rectangles. The smell of gunpowder still lingered as they sanded the edges smooth. Then, with hammers and nails that once built war, they constructed frames for the enemy's art. One of the guards, Sergeant Harold Dunn, was quoted in Stars and Stripes, April 1946. "If these men can make beauty in a prison, the least we can do is keep it from splintering." Each frame carried a paradox. The nails that once sealed ammunition now held landscapes of peace. Shell boxes became guardians of serenity. Someone etched a phrase inside one of the frames: "Let war guard peace." By the end of that week, more than 100 paintings were encased in wood that had once carried bullets. The Red Cross photographer captured the process. Hands still calloused from shovels and rifles, now working delicately over color and canvas. Inside Barrack 14, a young prisoner named Helmut Kraus wept as he watched his painting being framed. It was titled Der Heimweg, The Way Home, showing a dirt path through birch trees leading toward a distant church steeple. "This frame," he said softly, "is heavier than it looks." Captain Balsley, the camp commandant, approved of the gesture, writing in his report, "Symbolic action improves morale and cross-cultural respect." Yet for many who stood there, it was more than morale. It was redemption built from debris. That final exhibition stunned the visitors. Locals from Trinidad filed past rows of artwork bordered in oak and pine salvaged from war crates. One woman was overheard saying, "I never thought wood could remember." The framing became an unspoken ritual of closure. When the last piece was hung, the prisoners and guards stood together in silence. No speeches, no orders, just the creak of wood and the faint smell of linseed oil in the air. History often records battles, not gestures. Yet, in that small camp, every hammer strike echoed with the possibility that beauty could be built from what once destroyed. For the viewers of this story, do you think reconciliation begins with forgiveness or with the courage to protect what once belonged to your enemy? By the summer of 1946, Most of the camps had emptied. Trucks rumbled away from Trinidad, Colorado, their cargo not ammunition or prisoners, but crates marked "Art Property, Return to Sender." Inside, one of them lay a painting titled "Morning on the Elbe." Its creator, Private Wilhelm Brandt, had died 2 months earlier of tuberculosis in the camp infirmary. Before his final breath, he told the nurse, "Send it to my mother. She hasn't seen sunrise in years." The Red Cross honored that request. The painting itself was modest, oil on a small canvas board. A river flowed under a pale dawn sky, broken only by the silhouettes of fishermen on a wooden boat. The brush strokes were light, hesitant, as though painted by someone who knew he was running out of time. In the corner, instead of a signature, Brandt had written, "Für Mutti," for mother. When the parcel reached Hamburg, the city was still a skeleton of bricks and ash. The German Red Cross record, 1946, preserved the letter that accompanied the package. "Your son painted peace he never saw." Neighbors later recalled that Frau Brandt hung the painting in the only room of her half-destroyed house that still had a roof. Each morning she wiped the dust from the glass, saying softly, "He brought the light home." In that ruined home, the echo of Camp Trinidad lived on. The same sunlight that once shimmered on the Elbe now fell across broken walls in Germany. A bridge of light stretched between captivity and memory. Some of the paintings from the exhibition would later find their way into museums. The Smithsonian's Art of Captivity collection, the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, and even the Trinidad History Museum, where visitors today still stand before those quiet canvases. They read the small plaques beneath them and wonder, were these works born of sorrow or salvation? The truth lies somewhere in between. Those POW artists, stripped of uniform and ideology, rediscovered what war had stolen: the right to create, to imagine, to heal. They proved that art, even behind fences, could be freer than any army marching in victory. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, that beauty, painted by the defeated, outlived every speech of the victors. Today, if you visit the museum in Trinidad, you'll find "Morning on the Elbe" resting behind a glass case. Look closely, you'll see the faint reflection of your own face in the glass. A reminder that peace, too, needs someone to look at it to exist. In the quiet after war, there are no trumpets, no parades, only the slow sound of brushes on canvas, of memories being rewritten one color at a time. What began as an act of defiance in the stillness of a POW camp became a language stronger than propaganda, stronger even than grief. Behind barbed wire, men who had once followed orders to destroy learned to build again, not with stone or steel, but with imagination. The art born in those camps carried something rare: honesty. It did not hide behind uniforms or victory slogans. It spoke of longing, guilt, and fragile redemption. Each portrait, each landscape, was an admission that humanity had survived the machinery of war. In the strokes of Peace Farm, in the faceless women of Trinidad, in the eyeless self-portrait at Fort Devens, we see the same plea written again and again. Licht bitte, light please, light. Decades later, when museum visitors stand before those paintings, they do more than look at history. They complete it. Every gaze restores the light those artists once begged for. And in that moment, the divide between captive and free, victor and defeated, dissolves. Art had achieved what armies could not. It reconciled the irreconcilable. Perhaps that is the hidden legacy of those forgotten POW exhibitions, that beauty, once set free, never returns to captivity. It passes from hand to hand, from memory to museum, until even the silence it came from becomes sacred. So if you ever find yourself in front of a painting signed only by a number or a camp name, remember, someone once painted it not to be remembered, but to remember being human.